In the bleak, frozen winter of 1944, the Allied war machine in Europe was grinding to a halt. After a string of stunning victories following the D-Day landings, the advance had stalled at the German border. The supply lines were stretched to their breaking point, the troops were exhausted, and a bitter cold had settled over the continent. It was in this moment of weakness that Adolf Hitler decided to stake everything on one last, desperate gamble. On December 16th, under the cover of a brutal winter storm that kept Allied planes on the ground, he unleashed a massive surprise offensive through the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. This was the start of what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. The initial German assault was terrifyingly successful. Elite panzer divisions, led by monstrous King Tiger tanks, smashed through the thinly held American lines, creating chaos and panic. For the Allied High Command, it was a crisis of the highest order, and for the German soldiers pushing forward, there was a new sense of confidence. It really seemed as though the tide of the war, just for a moment, might be turning back in their favor. But then something strange started to happen. As German infantry formations gathered for their next assault, moving through what they thought was the safety of the forests, the sky itself seemed to explode. Shells from unseen American artillery didn't just whistle overhead and slam into the ground, they detonated in midair without warning. They showered down a firestorm of white-hot steel shrapnel that no foxhole or trench could protect against. There were no impact craters, no telltale whistle of a round about to hit. There was only a sudden, violent crack in the sky, followed by a level of destruction that was instantaneous and overwhelming. Entire formations were shattered and suffered catastrophic losses in an instant. Seasoned German troops, men who had stared down the horrors of the Eastern Front, were gripped by a primal terror. They were being hunted by a weapon that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a ghost in the artillery that struck with intelligent, malevolent precision. They had no idea what it was, how it worked, or how to stop it. This is the story of that weapon, the top-secret proximity fuse, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It's the story of how a team of civilian scientists, in a frantic race against time, created a technological marvel that would not only save London from a new terror weapon, but would be unleashed with cataclysmic effect in the forests of the Ardennes, shattering the last great army of the Third Reich. To really get why the proximity fuse was so revolutionary, you first have to understand the basic problem that had plagued artillery since day one, making a shell blow up exactly where you want it to. For centuries, gunners had only two real options for their fuses. The first was the contact fuse. Simple enough, the shell had to physically hit its target to detonate. This was brutally effective against a fortress wall or a battleship, but against a small, fast-moving target like an airplane, the odds of a direct hit were astronomically low. Early in the war, it was estimated that it could take an average of 20,000 anti-aircraft rounds just to shoot down a single enemy bomber. Gunners were essentially trying to hit a fly with a rifle bullet from a mile away. The second option was the timed fuse. This fuse could be set to detonate the shell after a few seconds in flight, creating an airburst of shrapnel meant to shred aircraft or infantry. While better in theory, it was wildly inaccurate in practice. The gun crew had to estimate the target's speed, altitude, and range, do a bunch of complex math under the extreme stress of combat, and then manually set the timer on the shell. Tiny error in calculation, a slight change in the weather or a minor defect in the fuse burning rate, and the shell would explode harmlessly hundreds of feet from its target. For both anti-aircraft and anti-personnel use, the results were deeply unsatisfying. Artillery was a weapon of saturation, not precision. The gunner's dream was a smart shell, one that knew when it was close to its target and could detonate itself at the perfect moment. It was a dream that seemed like pure science fiction. This problem became a full-blown crisis in the summer of 1944. A new and terrifying weapon was unleashed on Great Britain, the Fieseler Phi 103, better known as the V-1 flying bomb. To the people of London, it was the buzz bomb or doodlebug, a pilotless jet-propelled cruise missile that roared across the English Channel at over 400 miles per hour. Its crude pulse-jet engine made a distinctive sputtering roar that would suddenly cut out when it ran out of fuel, followed by horrifying silence and then a massive explosion. The V-1s were weapons of pure terror, aimed not at military targets but at civilian morale, and they were incredibly hard to stop. They were too fast for many Allied fighters and flew too low for traditional anti-aircraft guns to effectively track them with their inaccurate timed fuses. In the first weeks of the V-1 campaign, the success rate of Britain's anti-aircraft defenses was abysmal. London was under siege again, and the British government was desperate for a solution. A secret committee had been formed years earlier in 1940, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a huge believer in technology, kicked off what he called the Wizard War. This was an all-out effort to harness science for military advantage. British scientists had already been exploring the idea of a proximity fuse, trying out photoelectric sensors that would detect a target's shadow. But these were easily fooled by clouds and didn't work at night. They also had a theory for a radio-based system, but they believed the tech was too complex to develop quickly. Realizing they didn't have the industrial muscle to chase every idea while fighting for survival, the British made a critical decision. In August 1940, a top-secret group known as the Tizard Mission traveled to the United States. They brought with them a black box full of Britain's most advanced military secrets, including the cavity magnetron, the key to powerful, compact radar. They also brought the theoretical concept for a radio proximity fuse. They offered this treasure trove to the Americans, hoping to tap into the United States' immense, and still neutral industrial and scientific power. The Americans, led by the visionary scientist Vannevar Bush, head of the new National Defense Research Committee (NDRC), immediately saw the potential. The job of turning the impossible dream of a proximity fuse into a reality was handed to a brilliant and driven physicist named Dr. Merle Tuve. The project was given the intentionally boring name Section T, and its work would become one of the most important secrets of the entire war. The challenge handed to Dr. Tuve and his team at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory was by 1940 standards monumental. They had to build what was essentially a tiny radio station, stick it in the nose of an artillery shell, and make sure it survived being fired out of a cannon. The finished device, officially codenamed the VT fuse for variable time to fool enemy intelligence, needed to be a masterpiece of rugged miniature electronics. First, just think about the sheer force of being fired from a cannon. An artillery shell goes from a dead stop to supersonic speeds in a fraction of a second, subjecting everything inside to forces over 20,000 times the force of gravity. A fighter pilot might black out at 9 gs. The delicate parts of a radio, the vacuum tubes, the capacitors, the wiring, would normally be turned to dust under that kind of stress. The team's first thought was that it was impossible. The British, who had already played with the idea, thought it might work in a low-acceleration rocket, but a gun-fired version was pure fantasy. But the American team, a collection of the nation's brightest minds, refused to give up. Their first and biggest hurdle was the vacuum tube. In 1940, vacuum tubes were the heart of all electronics, but they were famously fragile, made of glass with delicate filaments inside. The idea of one surviving 20,000 gs was laughable. The team tried encasing the tubes in wax and plastic, but they shattered every time. The breakthrough came when they re-examined the problem. It wasn't just the straight-line acceleration destroying the tubes, it was also the spin. A shell fired from a rifled barrel spins at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute, creating enormous centrifugal forces that tore the tubes' insides apart. After countless failures, they developed entirely new kinds of vacuum tubes. Instead of fragile glass, they used rugged metal casings. Inside, the delicate components weren't just soldered in place, they were supported by tiny ceramic insulators and cushioned to absorb the shock. These were the first ruggedized vacuum tubes, an invention born of pure necessity. The Sylvania Electric Products Company rose to the challenge, eventually mass-producing these miniature marvels. The next problem was power. How do you power a radio inside a shell? A normal battery would be too big and would be destroyed by the launch. Plus, you couldn't have the fuse powered up while it was being handled. Any stray radio signal could trigger a premature detonation and kill the gun crew. The solution was as ingenious as it was simple: a small glass ampule filled with electrolyte fluid. When the gun fired, the force of acceleration would shatter the ampule, soaking a stack of tiny carbon and zinc plates and instantly creating a wet cell battery. This reserve battery made sure the fuse was completely safe until it left the gun barrel. But that led to another safety issue. What if the fuse armed itself too quickly and detonated right in front of the gun? The team built in a series of clever safety switches. One was a simple mercury switch. A small drop of mercury was held in a reservoir. Only after several seconds of sustained spinning would centrifugal force push the mercury to complete an electrical circuit, arming the fuse. This ensured the shell was a safe distance away before it went live. An additional self-destruct feature was also built in to prevent duds from being recovered and studied by the enemy. So how did it actually work? It was basically a tiny Doppler radar set. Once armed in flight, an oscillator in the fuse sent out a continuous radio wave. This signal would reflect off any object it hit. A receiver in the fuse would listen for this reflected signal. As the shell got closer to a target, an airplane or the ground, the frequency of the returning radio wave would change because of the Doppler effect, the same thing that makes a siren's pitch change as it passes you. When this frequency shift hit a specific value that corresponded to a lethal distance, usually about 20 to 50 feet, it triggered a special tube called a thyrotron. The thyrotron acted like an electronic switch, releasing stored energy to detonate the shell's main explosive charge. The entire project was a massive undertaking, rivaling the Manhattan Project in its scale and secrecy. Over 100 American companies were mobilized to produce the 130 tiny, complex parts for each fuse. Companies like Crossley RCA and Eastman Kodak, known for radios and cameras, were secretly converted into arsenals of this new wizard war. To keep it secret, production was compartmentalized. Workers in one factory had no idea what the parts they were making were for. By the end of the war, this colossal effort had produced over 22 million proximity fuses at a cost of over $1 billion, an astronomical sum at the time. The first successful test came in August 1942 aboard the cruiser USS Cleveland. 2 days had been scheduled for testing against drone targets. The tests were over in less than 4 hours. The first 3 drones were destroyed with just 4 proximity-fused shells. The observers were stunned. It was a level of effectiveness that was simply unheard of. The gunner's dream was now a reality. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena near Guadalcanal fired at a Japanese Val dive bomber. The second salvo detonated near the aircraft, which burst into flames and plunged into the sea. It was the first kill for the new secret weapon and a sign of things to come. For nearly 2 years, the proximity fuse remained one of the war's most jealously guarded secrets. Its use was strictly limited to naval and aircraft fire over open water. The Pentagon's reasoning was simple. If a dud shell fell onto land, the Germans or Japanese could recover it, reverse engineer the technology, and turn it against Allied bomber formations. The risk was just too great. That all changed in the summer of 1944. Faced with the relentless V-1 attacks on London, Allied command made the calculated choice to deploy the fuse in land-based anti-aircraft guns along the English coast. Any duds would fall harmlessly into the English Channel. The results were miraculous. In the first week of use against V-1s, anti-aircraft guns shot down 24% of the targets. 4 weeks later, with proximity fuses in widespread use, that number jumped to 79%. On some days, the success rate was over 80%. The buzz bomb threat to London was effectively over, all thanks to the secret weapon. It saved thousands of lives and proved the fuse's incredible potential. This success kicked off a new debate in the Allied High Command. Generals on the ground in Europe, hearing whispers of this miracle weapon, started demanding it for their field artillery. They saw its potential not just against planes but against ground troops. Imagine a shell that could explode directly above a foxhole or a machine gun nest, raining shrapnel down on the soldiers cowering inside. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, saw the huge tactical advantage and argued for its use. Still, the Pentagon hesitated, terrified of the enemy capturing the technology. The crisis in the Ardennes forced their hand. On December 16, 1944, as German panzers tore through American lines, the situation was desperate. Near Monschau, Germany, the U.S. 38th Cavalry Squadron was about to be overrun. Their commander sent a frantic call for help to the 406th Artillery Group, led by Colonel George Axelson. Axelson had just received his first shipment of the new top-secret POZIT shells, the codename for proximity-fused artillery rounds. His orders were clear: do not use them without explicit authorization. But watching the German assault about to break through, Axelson made a fateful decision. He decided the emergency on the ground was more important than the standing orders. He ordered his gunners to fire the POZIT rounds. Minutes later, 155 shells began exploding in the air above the advancing German infantry. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The German attack collapsed in chaos. They'd never seen anything like it. Word of this stunning success spread like wildfire. On December 19, with the German offensive still gaining ground, Eisenhower formally demanded authorization to use the fuse across the entire front. Faced with a potential strategic defeat, Washington finally gave in. The floodgates were open. American logistics swung into high gear. Within days, hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells flowed to artillery battalions all along the Ardennes front. Among the first to get them were the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, who were famously surrounded in the town of Bastogne. Their artillery support, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, was about to unleash a new kind of hell on the German forces, tightening the noose around them. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was racing north to relieve Bastogne, also got the new shells. He would soon witness their power firsthand. In a letter to the War Department, he described catching a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. He wrote, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion, and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." Patton, a man not easily impressed, was sold. The funny fuse, as he called it, was about to change the face of the battle. This secret weapon, developed in hidden labs and kept under wraps for years, was now fully unleashed. If you're finding this story of technological warfare fascinating, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us bring more of these incredible and often overlooked stories from history to light. Now let's get back to the Ardennes, where German soldiers were about to learn the true meaning of death from above. The Battle of the Bulge was fought in the Ardennes forest, one of Europe's most challenging landscapes. This dense, rugged terrain of rolling hills and thick pines was both a blessing and a curse. For the Germans, the forest provided excellent cover from Allied fighter bombers. Their doctrine was to use the woods to mask their movements and set up defensive positions. For centuries, forests had offered soldiers cover. But with the proximity fuse, the Ardennes was transformed from a sanctuary into a death trap. A conventional artillery shell, when fired into a forest, usually detonates on a tree trunk or the ground. Much of its explosive energy and shrapnel gets absorbed by the earth or a single tree. But a proximity-fused shell was different. As it passed over the treetops, its tiny radar would sense the ground and detonate the shell at the perfect height of about 30 to 50 feet. This created a perfect airburst. An inverted cone of thousands of razor-sharp steel fragments would scythe downwards, shredding everything below. The lethal radius of a 155 shell instantly increased. But in the forest, something even more terrifying happened. The downward blast wouldn't just saturate the area with steel. It would also hit the upper branches of the dense pine trees, shattering them into a secondary storm of wooden splinters. These flying shards of wood, some as large as daggers, became deadly projectiles themselves, multiplying the shell's destructive power. Soldiers who dove into their foxholes for cover, a reflex drilled into them by years of war, found there was no safety. The shrapnel and splinters rained down vertically, finding them in their supposed shelters. The very thing that was meant to protect them, the forest, had become an instrument of their destruction. The psychological impact on the German troops was catastrophic. These were not new recruits, many were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, but they were completely unprepared for this. They couldn't understand what was happening. They heard the American guns fire, but the shells never seemed to land. They just exploded in the sky as if by magic, unleashing a torrent of destruction. Their tactical doctrine was instantly useless. Spreading out didn't work. Digging in didn't work. Seeking cover in the forest didn't work. Captured German soldiers and diary entries from the time paint a chilling picture of confusion and terror. They called it magic shrapnel. They spoke of invisible explosions and a rain of steel from nowhere. Morale, already fragile, began to crumble. American intelligence reports noted that German commanders began offering rewards for any soldier who could recover an unexploded shell, desperate to understand the technology that was slaughtering their men. There are accounts of elite SS units being pinned down and decimated. Caught in a barrage of proximity-fused shells, the constant airbursts were so terrifying that some soldiers, driven mad with no way to fight back, reportedly stood up and charged directly into the artillery fire, yelling "Kamerad," preferring a quick end to the psychological torture. Near Bastogne, the all-African American 969th Artillery Battalion used their 155 long Tom howitzers to create a ring of death around the perimeter, their proximity-fused shells repeatedly breaking up German assault formations before they could even get close. German prisoners of war spoke of entire battalions being shattered in a matter of minutes, their medical services completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of shrapnel wounds. The weapon wasn't just killing them, it was breaking their will to fight. The proximity fuse wasn't the sole reason the German offensive in the Ardennes failed, but its impact was decisive. The weapon acted as a massive force multiplier for the outnumbered American defenders. It blunted the German assault, inflicted horrific casualties, and shattered the morale of their best remaining troops. General Patton, in his blunt assessment, declared that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. While that might be an overstatement, it shows the immense tactical and psychological shift the weapon created. From the Ardennes on, Allied artillery became exponentially more lethal. German forces learned to fear the telltale crack of an airburst, and their willingness to mass for attacks dropped significantly. The Allies had gained an edge that the Germans simply could not counter. Germany and Japan had both attempted to develop their own proximity fuses, but they had largely concluded the technical challenges, especially making vacuum tubes survive being fired from a gun, were insurmountable. They had deemed it a nearly impossible project, a fatal miscalculation that left them vulnerable. The fuse impact stretched far beyond Europe. In the Pacific, it was having an equally dramatic effect against a new and terrifying threat, the kamikaze. These suicide attacks were incredibly difficult to stop with conventional anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuse changed the math. Shells now only needed to get close to the diving aircraft to be effective. The kill ratio of naval anti-aircraft guns improved dramatically. One Navy study found that while it took an average of 1,000 time-fused shells to down one aircraft, it took only a quarter of that with proximity fuses. In fact, the fuse proved so effective at wiping out experienced Japanese pilots that some historians argue it was a contributing factor in Japan's decision to resort to desperate kamikaze attacks in the first place. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." It was a sentiment shared across the Allied leadership. When the full story of the proximity fuse was declassified after the war, it was immediately hailed as one of the most significant technological developments that led to Allied victory, often ranked alongside the atomic bomb and radar. The story of the proximity fuse is a story of science, secrecy, and shock. It marks a pivotal moment in the history of warfare, the dawn of the smart weapon. A problem that had stumped military engineers for centuries was solved in just a few short years by a team of civilian scientists who dared to do the impossible. They took the abstract principles of radio waves and Doppler shift and forged them into a rugged, reliable, and terrifyingly effective weapon. In the final, desperate months of the war, as German soldiers advanced through the frozen Ardennes, they were met not just by the courage of the American GI but by a technological ghost they couldn't see and didn't understand. The proximity fuse didn't just explode shells, it exploded the long-held rules of ground combat. It proved that a technological advantage, when used decisively, can shatter the physical strength and the psychological will of an army. While other weapons of World War II, like the atomic bomb, are remembered for their city-leveling power, the proximity fuse was a tactical revolution. It was a device that changed the mathematics of death on the battlefield itself, and in doing so helped seal the fate of the Third Reich. Thanks for joining us for this look into one of World War II's greatest secrets. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories about the hidden history of military tech, please consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell. And let us know in the comments what other secret weapons of history you'd like us to cover next. Until then, thanks for watching.